Okay, I think we can make a start. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Going Global session. I'm Summer and I'm the Communications Coordinator at THEP, which is the Tropical Health and Education Trust. Thank you to all of you who have already joined some of our previous sessions. If there's any that you have missed and you'd like to catch up on, the session recordings are all available on our Going Global website, which is just www.goingglobalday.com. Before we get started on the workshop, I'd just like to introduce our facilitators for the day. So we have Adrian and Nicholas from Bloom Consulting, who they have been working with over the course of 2021 to develop new and enhanced approach to ethical storytelling for vet. So I'll just hand over to them, who are going to carry on with the rest of the session.
Wonderful. Great. Welcome, everyone. Nick and I are very excited to be here. Summer already introduced us, but we both work at Bloom Consulting and we are very passionate about ethical storytelling and hope to share that passion with you today. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time. We love interaction, so we know that's sometimes hard on online platforms, but please feel free to shout. So what we'd like to do today is have obviously a very brief introduction, a few housekeeping rules, and then we really want to focus on sharing your volunteering experience. So what that could look like, what are different ways that people have shared their volunteer experience, and then really moving into how can you do that in an ethical way. So really focusing on what does it mean, ethical communications, and why is it important. Then there's lots of time for Q&A, and for closing we've got some links to resources and yeah, can answer any further questions you have. So in terms of digital housekeeping, just a few things to keep in mind. We really want to stress that this is a safe space. There are no wrong questions. Every question is valuable and we'd love to hear them. You can share these by raising your hand, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but otherwise it's at the bottom. It will pop up right there. Or use the chat box, or just unmute yourself, whichever you're comfortable with. This session's being recorded, just so that you're aware of that. And the recording, as well as slides, will be made available on the Going Global website. So you can find everything there. And on that note, I'll hand over to Nick, who's going to be talking about sharing your volunteer experience.
So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is ethical communications, an area which is very dear to Adrian and my heart for a number of reasons. Over the years, we have worked with different organisations, and one of our functions, particularly in reporting, is sharing the information that we have found. And over time, we have learnt that there are good ways of doing it and some less good ways to do it. Before we start, could I have some sort of idea of whether any of you are considering volunteering, and if you are, if you're going to be thinking about sharing your experience? Is there anyone? Show of hands, hands up, hands down. No? Okay, could I get the next slide then, please? So, sorry, is there a movement there? So yes, if you are in a position where you're going to be communicating your experience, there are, as you are probably aware, many platforms on which you can do this. They can either be formal platforms, so platforms that are required by the organisation you work for or are volunteering for platforms set up by donors. They could be your own personal website, they could be a blog site, they could be a formal blog site, but increasingly we're looking more at sort of at social media, so people communicating through Twitter, communicating through Instagram, communicating through WhatsApp, and communicating through Facebook. There are no right or wrong which platforms you should use. All are perfectly valid, but there are some criteria that needs to be considered when you choose the platform that you want to use and when you use individual platforms. Some general things to bear in mind is that many of the platforms are completely, particularly social media, are completely oversaturated with content. People have very short attention spans. Topics, particularly in the area of healthcare and international development, and can be quite challenging, and so condensing this into sound bites can be quite difficult as well. And so when you are choosing a platform, these are things that need to be considered, because what can happen is that in our desire to communicate information, we get sort of a bit over enthusiastic, and sometimes the information that we put out there is not necessarily as well thought as we probably would like it to be. Could I have the next slide, please? So we have examples. We're using an example of Instagram. Particularly, the specific example is the ICRC. Wonderful, very powerful images. Really get across the messages that whoever has posted them, the organization, wants to get across. But in doing this, you'd expect that there are certain protocols that have been followed, things that have been thought through before these images are put up. So it's not just putting them up, but also what messages they are giving. Could I have the next slide, please? This was taken from Child Hope Foundation. It's a lovely image. And you will probably find that when you are in the field, there will be people who want to have their photographs taken with you. However, there are a number of things to consider, which we will get into in just a bit with Adrienne. But what I'd like to do is ask you to just reflect on that picture and have a think about not necessarily the rights and wrongs with it, but what would have to go into the thought process before that picture is taken. Once it's taken, what it is used for and how it is used. We have a very happy child. We have a very happy person who has come from outside the community. It's a lovely picture. But what would have to happen before that picture would be appropriate for use in that particular context? Yep. Was there consent taken is a very valid point. So we'll now go into, if I could have the next slide, please. And we'd look at ethical communications and strategies. So once you've decided what platform you're going to use, once you've decided how you're going to take images, record conversations, document what it is that you see, what has to be taken into consideration in that process for you to finally be able to put it in whatever platform you're going to use. Have the next slide, please. And I'm now going to hand over to Adrienne to start talking through this.
Great, thank you, Nick. It was already mentioned in the chat box, which is of course great to see, is indeed with the image that Nick just shared, was there consent? Absolutely, but not just consent from the child, also consent from the parents. And interestingly, if we think about consent, it actually has got its history in the world of medicine. So the great thing is that doctors early on already realized that you cannot just administer certain medication or certain medical practices to patients without their consent. So consent itself has actually been around for quite a long time in the world of medicine. And from within medicine, it then moved on outside of that world. And I presume that all of you would have heard from GDPR, which was introduced in 2018. And I think what's really a little bit sad is that GDPR has got quite a name of it. You know, it's a little bit difficult. It's all these different boxes that you need to fill in. But the whole essence as to why GDPR was introduced was really to emphasize that consent is hugely important, and actually informed consent, which I will get to in a minute. And the whole reason why this is so important is, of course, firstly, because it is the right thing to do. Yeah, it is about making sure that there is dignity, respect for the people that you work with and for, and that you cannot just go around and share images. You wouldn't want that to happen from yourself. So why would we do that to other people? So it is very much the right thing. But what does that actually mean in practice? And don't worry, I'm not going to make this a legal lecture. I don't want to go into why GDPR, what the sort of all the nitty-gritty things of GDPR are, but there are two things that I would like to draw upon, and that is its reach. So when it was introduced in the European Union in 2018, the key element was that no matter where the data is collected, so whether that is written text, or whether that is medical information, or whether that is a photograph of someone, the information, it doesn't matter where it is collected, if it is used within the European Union. And of course, the UK was still part of that and has remained part of the GDPR legislation as such. That is not something that has been taken out with Brexit. Is that no matter where it is collected, if you use it in the EU, you have to apply GDPR. So suddenly its reach, where there always used to be data protection before, it's not like that was suddenly a new thing in 2008, but suddenly its reach went really beyond and across all borders. The big difference there was that there was this distinction between personal sensitive data, and that it was deemed that any data that is revealing racial, ethnic origin, religious or philosophical beliefs, or data concerning health, biometric data, or a person's sex life or sexual orientation or political orientation, and trade unionship is deemed personal sensitive data. And that means that you need to apply further protection in terms of using that data. And how does this all link into ethics? So if we then think about consent, the important thing that came about was that real thinking about informed consent. And informed consent is that someone who gives consent is really aware of the consequences. What are they agreeing to? And this, of course, is very difficult, because if you're in a situation where, you know, maybe you ask your grandmother if you can take a picture and put it in Instagram, she might not really know what Instagram is. And actually, she wouldn't really know where that information actually goes to. So what does it mean, informed consent? Or if you deal with people who are illiterate, how can you make sure that it is still informed? You could then, you know, you could maybe get a tick box, or you could get a thumbprint, and you can say, well, you know, they approved. But were they really aware of the consequences of agreeing for you to take that piece of information? And that is where there is this really important distinction, and that puts the onus on you as the person who will be communicating about your volunteer experience. And therefore, this doesn't matter whether this is on a closed WhatsApp group, or whether you put it on Instagram, or whether you have a private account on Instagram, or an open to public, or whether you write a blog for the organization that you volunteer with. The principle remains the same, that you need to make sure that you have done the right thing to share that information. And trust me, it is not as difficult as people make it sound. And a lot of it is probably things that you would do anyways. So I've put this picture here. And I don't know if people are up for it, whether you want to put it in the chat box, but maybe you can comment and let us know what you think is good about this picture, or what can be improved about this setting. To give you a little bit of context, it goes a little bit beyond just you taking a picture of at work. It was basically someone who's collecting demographic survey data. So going around and asking people a whole load of personal questions in relation to get your census for that country. So it'd be great if people want to share their views. I'll pause a minute, and otherwise, the girl's face is blurred. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Valentina. Very true. And that is the right thing to do. So it means she's not recognizable. So they did that very well. Anybody, any other thoughts on this? Yes, looks like they're in a private setting. Absolutely. So what's very important when you deal particularly with minors is that you're in a place where obviously the person feels safe. But what we always did in our work was, and I have to say that was in a research setting, so it wasn't so much about collecting images, but it was a lot about collecting actually data from people. When I interviewed young people or children, it was always in the setting of they can be overseen, but they cannot be overheard. You want to make sure that other people see you and that they feel that you are that they feel safe, that there are other people watching you, that obviously you also don't want to be in a position where someone can accuse you of making the child feel uncomfortable, but you also don't want to make the child feel uncomfortable with them being overheard. So indeed, private setting is very important. Someone else said, thank you so much, is that they're on the same level. Absolutely, very important. They are as equals. However, there is one thing, and of course this is guessing, but for the sake of the exercise, the child does look a little bit uncomfortable. One would also expect that maybe they would actually be sitting opposite each other. She sort of has to twist her head. So how comfortable is she with this conversation? And this is where things like consent become really difficult. And it really is for you to use your common sense. If you at any point feel that someone is uncomfortable, just don't. It's not worth it, because that's the last thing that you want to do. Or try to find out why they are uncomfortable. Maybe she just looks uncomfortable because she needs to be sitting like this, where if they would have just moved the chair, that it would have been fine. There is also a difference between consent and assent. And this is very important because what sometimes happens is that as long as you've got the parental permission, you think it's fine. But obviously that's not the case. The minor itself, he or she, has to agree as well. So what you need is assent from a child, and those can be made in child-friendly formats. You could work with smileys. You could be, are you happy for me to take your photograph? Someone could, point or circle and smile. Because it could also be that children are sort of coerced into either letting pictures be taken of them or sharing information with you by an adult who said, well, listen, this is important. Do you know what this organization does? And these are things you've got to be mindful of. There are power dynamics at play. So these power dynamics in relation to if you work as a health person, you are often viewed as, someone who's got huge amount of knowledge, is really respected in the organization. So be mindful of that. And if you're unsure, either ask again or ask in a different way. Do they say yes because you're the person in the white coat, or do they say yes because they really are happy for you to share that information? And make it practical. So if you feel that they don't know what Instagram is, you can show them, pull out your phone and say, this is what will happen, and explain that other people can see that. If it's a closed group, you can say it's only people who follow me. These are only mostly my friends because I've approved them, or those are my colleagues. Or if it's open, try to explain that it goes beyond and what that means, where that information will go to. Or if it goes in a magazine, try to bring a copy and say, listen, this is what it means if you agree to it. So yes, consent forms are very important. Information sheets, and I'm going to get to these in a minute, are important, but really try to think practically in the context where you are, in the culture where you are. This is an example of the consent form from FET. And I have to say, this is only one part of the form. There is also an information sheet. And it's important. So the information sheet is something that lists out, why am I here? Why am I asking you to share your photograph? What am I going to do with that photograph? Who's going to see this photograph? How long am I going to keep this photograph? Can you pull out? What happens if you decide you no longer want that photograph out there? So there's all this information. And again, make sure that you write that in a language that someone understands. Obviously, make sure that they can read if they can't explain it to them. But also use simple language in the local language to really make it understandable. So a good way, for example, is by doing it through questions. So why am I here? Why am I asking you this? I think we've got a comment. In some settings, power dynamics come in when the person taking a photo or interviewing is white. How would you deal with that? Yeah, that's a great comment. So let me get onto that first. Absolutely, there is definitely, there are a lot of different power dynamics. It could be because someone represents an aid organization or a government, or indeed it is because of the color of their skin, or it is because of the position that they hold in society, or it is because of the profession that they do. I think the first step in that is really being aware that these power dynamics exist. And then to try to make sure that the person is really comfortable. Sometimes you could do that by then making sure, if you're not sure, I would always stop. I would say just never go ahead. You know, that person is way more important than the image. There are other opportunities to get the data or the image that you want. Maybe to get someone who speaks the local language to double check and get them to ask, and really stress that it is okay to say no. To say there's no problem, you know, we really don't need this photo. And sometimes that help, and say that nothing bad is going to happen if you say no. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop treatment. It doesn't mean that we're not going to help your child, like absolutely not. So these are things that can really help. Nick, I don't know if you want to add anything to that specific question. I've maybe got an example that jumps to mind.
It's definitely something that you have to bear in mind. In our experience, there is often a lot of excitement when someone from outside the communities, irrespective of where they come from, arrives. Cameras are a source of fun. You know, hello, can you take a picture of me? But I think there also has to be some homework done before you enter into a community generally. I know that in my experience, there are parts of certainly remote Latin America where taking a photograph is considered an invasion of privacy. Somehow, on some level, that takes away from a person's soul. You have to be very, very mindful of that. And as Adrienne said, or mentioned, you can have, you might be perceived as the person who can, because you're an outsider, bring in things like money to the community for buying, fixing up schools, for buying school equipment, or in some extreme cases, you can find yourself being asked to be the arbiter in all sorts of local dynamics that perhaps you are unaware of, and often unable to support.
There's another comment, which I think is a wonderful comment. Thank you very much for that, Steve.
Yes.
Steve has commented to say that, you know, in the real world, there often is a real lack of privacy, and, you know, there's lots of things going on. There is no space to talk confidentiality. There is a language barrier, and there are free-for-all people who want to translate things in different dialects. And I think that's a wonderful example. And I think that is why I think the most important thing around ethics is to try to make it work with what you've got. And this is where we want to move away from, of course, at the moment, we've got this form up, and this form is important, but it is not the end game. It is more important that you've got verbal informed consent, and that that person really knows what they are agreeing to, where you can sign, you can then say, I've spoken to this person, I have explained it. So do keep a record of it, by all means. But that it instead of the signature. And what we have found with various organizations over time, particularly after 2008, when this became so much more known and also stricter, is that it became a tick box exercise, which is really unfortunate, that it moved away from what it actually intended to do in the first place. And that's moved away from that, and that people have just been focused on this tick box where we get the signature and where people agree to. And what we really want is indeed to try to work with what you've got, and there, keep things in mind. So if you can move away, try to find that privacy. Or if you're not sure, then maybe take a photograph where the person isn't recognizable. You know, that is one way. Or you can sometimes see, even if you can't understand the language, you can sometimes see if someone is slightly pressured. If they're like, well, just say yes, just say yes. Even if you don't understand, you can sort of see by the movements or by the way how people are talking at someone to try to get them agree. And that is where you can then step in and say, hey, it's all right. You know, I was just asking because I thought it was a nice story to tell, but there's really no need, it's absolutely fine. And just continue with your business as usual. And I know that is not clear cut, and I know that is difficult, but I think that is the reality of obtaining informed consent, is that it is difficult, and that is maybe why things have sort of spurred to becoming a tick box exercise, because then you've got something tangible. But in a way, it is more important to really try to think of what you see and for you to judge. And I know that that is not easy. But sometimes you could check with someone else and say, hey, what do you think? You know, I'm not sure about this. But I always would say, if in doubt, then don't. Now, in terms of if you're trying to obtain information, then I really do think it is very important, because that could have very severe consequences for people. So, for example, if we think of sexual orientation, these are not questions that you can ask in certain contexts, because in some countries that would actually constitute of the death penalty, depending on the answer that people would give. So if you want to talk, and this is where that distinction about personal sensitive information, if you want to have anything like that, you have got to indeed try to prepare and then create a safe space. If you, for some, maybe you're doing a research project and some of that information is critical for what you need, then indeed you have to invest the time and the resources up front to create these safe spaces and to make sure that they are. It is also about the information that you share. So what if you had a really interesting discussion with someone on a private level, and you've got a nice picture of the both of you, and this could be completely innocent, right? Like there's no maliciousness meant, but you both chatting, you're in a lovely setting, you take a selfie and you say, hey, Juan and me had a great chat about the authoritarian leadership in this country and how they're wrecking the health center, smiley. You could have just put that person in immense danger without any intention of doing that. And maybe Juan was fine with the picture because you were both having a nice chat and it was a lovely setting, but he wasn't aware that that was the text that you were going to add. So what we're very much trying to do here is just to open up, the different avenues of what to think of when you are dealing with people's information. So whether that is written, whether these are images, and I'm afraid that 1 hour is not going to be enough to cover absolutely everything, but there are a set of resources that we can refer you to, and of course we're very happy to chat to you. You can follow up by email with any further questions as well. I think there was the other comment about local notes are often difficult. Where should this consent be lodged if taken? Yeah, absolutely. Again, great point. So this is where we refer to the organization that you're working with. So hopefully they would have a set of consent forms. And if they are good consent forms, there is a bit where it says verbal consent. I haven't included that in this presentation, but we're very happy to follow up and share these. And I think FET will be adding their consent forms on their website at some point as well, which has that section where it allows you to say, I have read the information sheet, I have shared this information, and this person consented, and then write the context. And that is something that in legal terms is the legitimate interest that you as a person sign for. But if you've got someone who can read and write and who is happy to consider it, one of the great practices, and again, I know that this involves costs or sometimes planning, but is to distribute consent forms, the information sheets ahead. So for example, you want a day where you want to take a number of pictures, or you want to come in and collect information on a specific topic, that you actually go a week before, you make sure that the information sheets are translated and that they're distributed so that people have time to think about it, they have time to discuss it, and it's not sort of out of the blue, someone rocks up and says, hey, great, can we have an interview? We'll go and sit over there, you know, and all very nice and jolly, but some people would prefer to have that time to think about it. So that would be great practice if possible. But again, we appreciate it. Sometimes areas are very remote, very difficult to get to, or there could be a monsoon, or there could be a roadblock, could be all sorts of things that prevent you. But these are all steps that you could take, but we appreciate it's not always easy. So just moving on, timing.
Yeah,
please.
Made by Steve to everyone that in their experience they found that confirming patient's identity before surgery is a photograph of them with the synopsis of the clinical scenario. Steve, probably in that case, because it's the individual is about to undergo a medical procedure, there are, I would imagine based on what you're saying, that there will be some sort of medical protocol, yes, the WHO check established. It's not that consent doesn't have to be obtained, that person's image, but the context might be slightly different in that case because it's for a medical procedure that they are there and it's life-saving or whatever it is. Quite a lot of what Adrienne has been referring to is the sort of sitting down and telling the story outside of a medical context, discussing with women in a waiting room, for example, about their thoughts on access to medicines or to their status in the community, that sort of thing. So yes, you're still capturing an image, but there is in that particular case probably a slight difference, and there is already a protocol, probably a medical protocol in place. That's more to do with sort of identification and presumably making sure that the right person gets the right treatment.
Absolutely, and I think what is important in that sense is where is the image stored, how long is it stored for, and who has access to it. So if it really is to identify the patient, to make sure that, you know, you've got it for the record that this is the treatment that they have received, then there are also rules on retention. And the WHO definitely has this. I'm afraid I don't know them by heart, but they will have the rules as to that they have to be stored securely and that they have to be kept for a certain amount of time. But in that case, the photographs are part of the consent that they have provided that they want to undergo that procedure. If a person is unconscious and is not able to agree, then there is often an overarching element of you are applying a life-saving method, and that at that point takes precedence over the identity. But that doesn't mean you don't need to protect that identity. So there would be rules in terms of who then takes that photograph. And these are things that, again, we appreciate are really hard, because if you're in a context, it's sometimes easier to just snap it on your phone. But then is your phone password protected? Do you indeed then transfer them to the right place afterwards? So there are things like that we can know sometimes could be additional work, but are very important in terms of that. Steve, don't worry, we love questions. So please keep asking any questions you have, and anyone else as well. Please, no need to apologize. As we said, we welcome all thoughts and all feedback. And for us, what is key is that, as Nick said, you know, we're both very passionate about this, but we want to make this session useful for you. So please ask as much as you want. We're here to answer them. So going in a little bit into ethical storytelling is this goes beyond the legal requirements. So this is really the organization that you work for and you as a person thinking beyond what are the legal requirements of GDPR, what is important. And the first starting point there would be, if you volunteer with an organization, do they have a policy? Do they have a code of conduct on this? It could be captured under ethical storytelling, ethical images, safeguarding, ethics. It's got different names, but it is important for you to ask that question. Hopefully they would give it to you, but here it is important for us to share that this is a field in transition and that we see more and more health organizations and more charities who are starting to implement or as an organization adapt these type of policies, but not everyone has them yet. But that would be your first call. What is the policy? What are the rules on this? And then also, if they don't, what are you comfortable? What for you is ethical? So to give you some examples, so if you think purely of images in this regard, and now we are talking to images for marketing purposes, images that go out to the world that you share on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, is the capture, what do they represent? So what do you want that story to tell? And how accurate are you going to be? So to give you an example, again, between that balance of protecting identity and accuracy, are you going to pin the location of where that image is taken? If that involves people, is that a wise thing to do? Or are you just going to keep it wider and say, well, you know, I took it in this county or in this province or in this country even, or in this city, if it's a big city. So, but accuracy is, are you telling what this is about? So I always feel that actually WaterAid as an organization, and we've got some examples from them later, but they have an image policy and they have an ethical image policy, and they have a great example where they say, okay, let's say you have a really dirty water source. Now, if that water source is in country X, you can use that image to talk about the situation of clean water in that country. But if WaterAid does not work in that location, you can never, ever claim that we are working in that location. And in terms of what it represents, they want to make sure that it represents that it's non-discriminatory, that it represents equality. So they never want pictures that showcase the sort of white savior. And sometimes these, again, happen incidentally. I know Nick has got a great example, actually. I don't know if you want to share that example of
yes,
the person visiting. Yeah.
Yes. There are times when someone will come from outside the community and custom dictates that they are greeted in a certain way. Now, in some parts of this world, this can be a cup of tea. In other parts of the world, it can be singing, it can be dancing, it can be flowers, it can be putting leis around people's necks. And in some cases, it can have it can be an abeyance in front of an individual, even touching their feet, for example. One of the organizations I used to work for, there was a visit by an individual who was very high up in the organization, and there was much excitement about this person turning up. Unfortunately, when the official photograph was taken, it was just at the moment where an Anglo-Saxon European lady, as she is, bedecked in all these flowers, had about 15 ladies from somewhere in Southeast Asia bending down and reaching to touch her feet. What had actually happened, that was the picture that was taken, what actually happened immediately afterwards, she tried desperately hard to bring them all up and say to them, no, please don't do this. But the image stuck, the image was captured. So you just have to be very careful on what is portrayed and in the moment at which that picture is taken. it got sorted out in the end. It was just a little bit embarrassing. There were a couple of pictures taken subsequently, which fortunately showed everyone with their heads at the same site. But there was a sharp intake of breath from the press.
So these are very important things to think about, as are, for example, image manipulation. Do you allow cropping of pictures? Do you allow people to Photoshop? And to what extent is that acceptable? And does it still show the truthfulness of the picture, of the story that you are trying to tell? We referred to it earlier. Transfer and retention of images is really important in this as well. So here is a very beautiful picture of WaterAid, and we just wanted to highlight this one because I think it's a great example of how they capture, how they've captured their work, where it's clearly in a school setting, but you cannot recognize any of the students. So they overcame the problem of having to seek consent of all the students and probably their parents, obviously depending on their age. So in this case, it would have been the teacher who would have agreed to provide consent. Clearly what they're doing is right in the middle of the frame. But it is a lovely setting how they have created an image that one, we assume that there is consent of the teacher, and given their policy, I'm sure there is. But it just shows a creative way of how you can still deal with these things. And we appreciate that an award that sometimes people look in different directions, that might be a bit harder, but you could then blur out the images, or you could really focus on your key subject. And this is important as well, is if you are going to take photographs in a hospital, obviously you need consent of the management of the hospital. You cannot just go around and take photographs. But if you then zoom in on individual people who are recognizable, you've got to make sure that you've got that individual consent. And if it is children, you need that parental consent, but you also need the assent from the child who in a form that they understand, and that really does mean simplified. And sometimes that could mean showing. What does it mean? Why to take a photograph? How does it work? Or how does a recorder work? If you're going to do a little video or you're going to record a voice. So make it as practical as you can. I think there was a comment as well.
Adrienne, if I may add something.
Yeah.
When an image is being taken, yes, as Adrienne said, this probably has got consent. It's a very good image. But just be mindful of what is in the background. So there is a script, I don't know if it's Arabic or Urdu, which is on the back wall. That can sometimes be an identifier. Adrienne made a comment earlier about when you're taking a picture, not pinning it. Just be mindful sometimes that there's can be something going on in the background as well, which either gives some information about who's in the room, where they are, which might not necessarily be something that you want to do. But yes, there is a comment from
Steve. As web editor of Eurolink, we don't suggest that any images are shared via SOMI, but they're only displayed on our open access platform once they've been screened for appropriate ethicality. Absolutely, and therefore I would hope that Eurolink would have a clear policy as what does that mean? What does ethicality mean? And this again changes, and that actually brings me to the next image. And I don't want to pass judgment on this because there are different views. It's a very powerful image. From the International Committee of the Red Cross, highlighting the struggle in South Sudan. But there would be organizations who would have a policy who would say we only showcase fully dressed people. Now, in this case, you could then say, well, actually, his bandage is partly over his upper body, or he consented to this, so it's all right, or we are really trying to showcase the medical element. But the reason why we wanted to highlight this image is there is, in a sense, there is no global golden standard, right? There is no UN resolution on what is an acceptable ethical image. There is the legality of GDPR, and then there is the ethics that as an organization that you work for hopefully would have discussed and would have set the boundaries for themselves. If you don't have these boundaries, ask what people are comfortable with. what the context is of that context. We know that there are cultures, but of course there is, you know, the level of clothing is very different, and the acceptance of that. But we just wanted to highlight that, because otherwise this picture shows a clear setting, it explains a certain situation. But we wanted to highlight that in relation to representation. And that is where these lists are of, you know, how far do you go? For example, do you allow changing of colors, cropping, enhancement, editing? So for example, with film footage, we have seen examples of where it's got lost in translation. So, and I know that cost is sometimes prohibited for this, but it's always best to get a formal professional translation for your video, if possible, because sometimes you know, someone very sweetly says, oh, this is what they're saying, and it actually turns out they're saying something very different, which is then pointed out to you later if, you know, someone in the mother tongue realizes, sees that and goes, oh, well, that's not what they said. So these are just things to be mindful of. Staged scenarios. Now, this is something that is, again, something that we've seen changing over time. And we are not here to say what is right or wrong, but we do know that there are a number of organizations who have said that, for example, people are holding up signs with thank you, that actually that could be, in a way, quite patriarchal and maybe not the image that you want to portray. So some organizations have said we're not doing that. Sorry, Nick.
It can be seen as coercion as well. You've come along and you've said, okay, well, we represent this organization. Can you show our donors that you're happy and thankful?
Yeah.
Without necessarily finding out whether people are happy and thankful.
Absolutely. So yeah, staged scenarios, think about that, or set up or superimposed images, you know, what does that represent and what does it show when you do that? We wanted to highlight the work that we had the absolute pleasure of working with together with FED, where we created an ethical storytelling code of conduct. And we just, you know, it's a whole document by itself. As said, we don't have time to go through it in detail, but we just wanted to show you the highlights of what a document like this actually contains. So it really breaks down, what does it mean, obtaining informed consent, and what are things to consider in that? As you can see, it all highlights that there are different types of consent. So there is the individual consent, there is community consent, there is getting consent from a hospital, there is consent for online data collection, there is consent at events. So there are all sorts of consents to think about, and they're all slightly different, but the principle remains the same. And that is that consent is freely given, that it is truly informed, and that someone is aware of the consequences of that consent gives. And there is one thing that I really do want to highlight, because I've seen that in different consent forms, and truth be told, I've often seen that bit missing, and that is an end date. So people then say, oh, here is an email that if you no longer want your image, you know, if you no longer want us to use your image, or you no longer want us to use your data, this is the person you can contact, and then, you know, we'll stop using it. The truth is, when that image is already out in the public domain, you are not going to be able to pull that back. You won't. It's out there. You as an organization can promise that person that you will no longer use that specific image, but it's already out there. And when it's out there, you don't know who else picks it up or does what with it. So a better way to deal with that is to be honest up front and say, if you contact me before that date, I can completely make sure that it is not used. That is the date that, you know, either I want to put my blog out, or I want to go and put it on Instagram, or I want to publish my report or share that video. After that date, you can contact me, and I will make sure that I will no longer use it, and no one in my organization will, but I cannot promise you that it will disappear completely from the World Wide Web. And that is a way more honest thing than saying, oh, fine, you know, we'll fix it for you. So that is one thing that I did want to highlight, because I often see that one missing. There's a link with safeguarding. We spoke about that a little bit in the setting of the image that we put. There's a whole lot about transfer of images and video storage and longevity, image manipulation when you work with other people. specific consent from vulnerable adults and children. Photo credits as well, very important. Remuneration, that's often for official video crews. Obviously, most organizations would say, we never want to pay to take someone's image. But where you might want to think about is if you're going to ask, you're going to do a video shoot for 3 days in a hospital, and you're asking all sorts of help from people who actually then can't do their normal job. What effect does that have? And is there a level of remuneration for that loss? So again, things to think about. Too much for today's session. I am aware of time. So what I actually wanted to do was move over to questions.
Steve has brought up an interesting point about using images that predate when consent was mandated. Yeah, this is a big question mark, and it's a source of much debate.
It depends per country as well.
Yeah.
So this is the challenging thing, is that every country has got a different set of rules on data retention. Some countries say you cannot keep an image beyond 4 years. So in any case, that would mean that, in the coming year, those images would be out of date. GDPR specifies the following. GDPR says that you've got to decide when it is still useful for your organization to keep this image. The moment that it is no longer useful to have, you should have no longer a right to keep it, unless it is for research purposes or for historical archive purposes. So if you want to keep a historical track record of your organization, yes, you can keep a number of images, but no way can you keep all the images that you took, because that wouldn't stand the legal test of actually, is this still useful for your organization? No, if it's historical, then you make a selection. You should also want to question, how accurate is that still? So if, as an organization, you want to portray that, you might actually want to make an ethical decision as an organization and say, images that are more than 5 years old, we do not use. But the exceptions are, for example, in locations where there is huge amount of conflict, or where there is a regime and therefore it's frowned upon to take any images, but you still want to be able to share that work. You might then want to have the exception and say, well, actually, we keep a little bit more of an archive on that specific country. But yeah, per country, I'm afraid that changes, and therefore you should also always look at the legal structures in that country, and hopefully the organization that you volunteer with will have that information. I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions? Should we continue to display screened images that have been, oh, that was the question, yeah. Are there any other questions? Do people feel today was useful, or if we just opened a whole can of worms?
It is a very complex issue, and it's also not just the logistics of it, but it can be quite emotive as well, because there are people who feel that in the work they do, that images should be kept for archival reasons, or just because they were nice images, without necessarily thinking through why the images are being kept. And also realizing that it's not just a pretty picture, it's a pretty picture, but it is of someone or of a particular context. And in a way, it's that individual's story, it's that individual's being that is being used, and that has to be respected.
Steve, you've raised your hand, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. I think it's been a really useful session, and it's helped clarify a number of things for me. On a sort of an administrative front, if you are going to display stuff, should you be registered with the Information Commissioner in the UK?
I'll be honest, I need to get back to you on that specifically. I don't think you do, as long as your sourcing is correctly, but can I come back with you on that specific question? Yeah.
Yes, certainly.
But yeah, my first inclination is I don't think, as long as your referencing is correct, but I'll double check. Are there any other questions?
Steve, is it okay if we get back to you through our colleagues at FET?
Yes, or I'll send Adrienne my email address.
Wonderful, thank you. Great. Are there any other questions or comments or concerns, or is there anything that we can help by sharing specific information or specific resources? In any case, I'll pull up the next screen, but please feel free to keep sharing questions or thoughts. So of course, we want to highlight Pulse is a platform where in terms of if you're interested in volunteering, you might already know the platform, but there's a whole array of information there. FET has a very interesting volunteer kit as well, with lots of information. There's more information specifically on virtual volunteering. And we just wanted to highlight, we know that FET hasn't published their ethical policy on storytelling as yet, but I do believe, but I'll let them answer that themselves, that they will be making things like consent forms and things available to other people. However, in the meantime, I think, and I wouldn't say it is the golden standard, but I do think it's a really good one. I think there are a few things that they can add, but WaterAid earlier in this year published their ethical image policy. So pay attention, this is purely on images, but I think it's a really good one. So, and it's not a long read. So if you're interested in the topic and you just want to get a feel for what is out there, I think that's a good starting point. Are there any other comments or questions? In that case, we've got 2 minutes before the time ends, so we're just on time. Yeah, I mean, we really hope that today we've given you a snippet as to why it is so important, and we know that we haven't always given you the clear-cut answer, but that is because it is so context specific. But the more you read about it and the more you're comfortable you feel, that often really helps in terms of your judgment, because sometimes that is really a judgment call, but in the parameters of what has been set out. And as I said, it is definitely a field that is moving, and I'm happy to say I think it is moving in the right direction, but the more people discuss it and think about it, the better we can get. So work in progress, I would say, and I hope you can all be part of that journey. Thank you so much. You've been wonderful online. Thank you for all your great questions and thoughts. We really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. I'm wishing you all a lovely day wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Just from FET, thank you both, Adrian and Nick. It was a great session, and I just want to jump in quickly and say that we have 4 more sessions ahead of us, starting with next week's session on how to prepare professionally and personally to engage effectively with global health volunteering. And a final plug, we have our annual conference starting next week. So that's over 4 half-day sessions on the 7th, 8th, 11th and 12th of October. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including Chris Whitty, Dr. Leah Tedesi, who's the Minister of Health for Ethiopia, and Elizabeth Iro, who's the Chief Nursing Officer for the WHO. So it'd be great to see some of you there. Thank you all again for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.